Hi everyone, I'm Liz Haywood and a very warm welcome to this sew along for this waist bag. This pattern came about as an attempt to try and make some kind of waist bag or bum bag that didn't use zips, so that if you used natural fibres and cotton thread you could make a fully compostable bag, and you would just have to take off the button if you used plastic or metal. To wear this bag, you just slip it through a belt that you already have, like this. And it sits like this. I hope you enjoy making one, and please enjoy this sew along. You will need to print out the pattern, and to join these, fold over this X in the corner like this, and then it's easy to align them with the other X's like this. So this is half the pattern, it's cut on the fold here, and I suggest cut out this rectangle shape and then cut them apart. Here we are, all cut out. I'm going to be tracing mine onto the fabric with chalk, and so all my notches I have cut like this. I use this tool from when I was a pattern maker, but if you haven't got one of those, and you probably don't, you can make an easy little notch to slip a piece of chalk through just by doing that. For fabric you need something sturdy like denim or lightweight canvas or upholstery fabric, and I'm going to use this offcut of denim that I've used for a lot of other things. So I'm going to put the pieces on like this and trace those, and then flip them over like this and trace the other half. You might need to do that if your fabric's very thick and you have trouble cutting through 2 layers of it. And I've just decided that I would like a row of spots in the middle of my bag, or a row of gaps between spots. So I'm just going to shift my pattern over a bit like this, so that it's I've got a symmetrical pattern. When you cut this out, you'll find it's quite quick because you've got shared lines, but you have to be accurate. And snip these when you get to notches. Give them a tiny snip with the end of your scissors, but make the snips really tiny, like 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters, because you've only got a 6 millimeter seam allowance on the whole thing. On the piece that's on the fold, snip the middle here and here, so you've got the center point. Before you start sewing, overlock around the edges of all the pieces. I don't normally do that when I sew, but because this is quite thick fabric and your overlocker might not cope with 2 layers, it's easiest to just do that first. And if you haven't got an overlocker, just do zigzag on your regular machine. Here we are, all overlocked and ready to go. It's good exercise in overlocking curves, isn't it? When you overlock, just don't trim anything off, of course, just graze the edge, And you should still be able to see your notches through the overlocking like this. If not, you can just pop the pattern back on and put them in with a pen or something like that. So this piece here we're going to pop aside, and we will need these and these. Put them like this. And we're going to sew 2 centimetre seam here and a 2 centimetre seam along here. But we need to leave a gap for the button, which will be like this. It's a gap in the seam that becomes the buttonhole. So you'll need the button to make sure the hole is the right size. So the instructions say a 3 centimetre button, but all I could find at home was a 2.5 centimetre button, but I think that'll do. But you don't have to use a button. You could use a magnetic clasp or a giant press stud or even a dob of Velcro. And if you want to have quick access to the bag, then something like a magnetic clasp would be ideal. For this one I used a beer bottle flattened to make a well, an upcycled sort of button. So I suggest marking where the gap for your buttonhole is going to be. So when you get to it, you can leave the right gap, but my button's a bit smaller, so I will just go a bit smaller here. Leave about, leave about 3 millimeters either side, so you've got enough play for the button to slip through, because this is really thick, so it'll need to be a little bit bigger than you would normally make. And make an identical hole in the identical place on this, because they need to line up with each other. Right, and I'm going to be sewing this entire bag in red thread so you can see what I'm doing. Here we are all stitched with the gap for the button, and make sure you securely backstitch either side and press the seam open. Put this piece aside for now and take this one, and you're going to stitch it on this, but not on the end that's got the buttonhole, the other end. And you'll be sewing down and around and to here. And you'll see this is bigger because this side has the pleats, which I have just darkened mine up with chalk. So fold those over and hold with a pin, and the same here. I'll just put in a pin to mark my centre. And then this should fit with a bit of play here so that you'll be able to put your hand into the bag. And here it is stitched. Just a reminder that you've only got a 6mm seam allowance to help you get around these curves. We're going to hem these ends now with a 2 centimetre hem. So fold this, press this open like this to make it less bulky. I'm just going to fold that 2 centimetres, that, and stitch across. And here it is stitched. So you'll see this stitching here. And give it a press because it's a bit hard to press when it's been closed up. Do it while it's flat. In this next step, we are going to sew these two together for just 5 centimetres or 2 inches here and here. So I'm just going to measure it Pop a pin in here. And then I'll put these together and just sew with a 6mm seam. Make sure you back stitch very securely at each end of this seam. But before I do that, I'm going to make this bag a little bit fancier than in the instructions, because I would like a smarter opening for this bag. So you can see on this finished one that this is just an overlocked edge turned under, and this is just overlocked and stitched down on the right side like that. But I would like to finish this with bias binding. When I open the bag, I would like to see this, and on this opening edge I would like to see it looking like this, and it'll be on the inside. So if you would like to do that along with me, you won't need very much bias binding. It's just a 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimetre. What I'm going to do is just top stitch it on so that there's my 5 centimetres, so I'm a little bit past the 5 centimetre mark, and I'm just going to stitch it so it's just covering, so it's just covering that overlocking. And here it is stitched on, just covering that overlocking there. And then I'm just going to sew this seam as per the instructions. Match these up perfectly, 5 centimetres along. Like this. And I'm going to stitch like that. And then you can see that that will get turned to the inside when the seam is finished. And here it is stitched. Just flip it to the right side and check that you've cleared the overlocking and the bias binding, and you can't see any of it. Now we are going to stitch this part around like this. But before I do, I'm going to do the same bias binding thing, and this time I'm going to stitch it so that instead of stitching it on the edge of the bias binding, I'm going to come in a bit like this. So maybe the overlocking sitting halfway in the bias binding, and I'm going to do that all the way along. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to stitch around like this. Okay, here it is finished, stitched around, and just check again that you've cleared the overlocking in these corners and that you've caught all the bias binding. You can see that I didn't on the first round. I had to go back and actually I had to go back and stitch twice, and this, I had to go back and stitch on this one here. So if you're using bias binding, this should meet exactly where that previous seam was. You can see that if you stitch the bias binding too far down, it'll overstep the corner here. So higher is better. So let's turn it inside out. Oh, sorry, roundabout way rather. Because we are nearly finished. And this looks a lot better on the inside flap than this. Give this all a thorough press around all these seams that you've sewn, and stitch this down like this along the other edge of the bias binding. Or if you're not using bias binding, just stitch along in the center of the overlocking all the way along. And looks like I used navy on that side. And here it is all stitched down, and that's the other side. I'm going to hem this front edge now, and if you're using bias binding like me, you can stitch this with the bias binding uppermost and go down and then across and then back up. Or if you're using no bias binding, just overlocking, stitch in the middle of the overlocking and turn it over like a generous 1/4 inch, 6mm, and it looks like I just stitched this one starting at the beginning. And here it is stitched, and you can cut off this triangle-y bit in the corner here for a neater finish. I already did this side here. You can also do it as here as well if you're not using bias binding. You can cut these off and then they won't poke out. Take your button and check that it's going to fit through this buttonhole that you've made. Mine fits quite easily. And to hold the buttonhole in place, we're going to top stitch around up like this and down again around the buttonhole and back up the other side. You could, if you didn't want top stitching around here, you could just stitch around the buttonhole, but you'll need to hold those layers in place. And you can see on this one, I just started here around the buttonhole, back up the other side. Here's mine stitched. If this bit is too thick for your sewing machine, it's very thick here and very thick around the buttonhole, just walk your machine by hand around the edge so that you don't give it a hernia. Decide where the best place for your button will be, where the flap sort of sits naturally. You can just peel this back and pop a pin in the middle where you're going to sew it. Maybe a bit higher for me, like this. So when you sew the button on, because you're only sewing through one layer of fabric here, put a folded piece of fabric behind the buttonhole like this to reinforce it, otherwise it'll just pull through a single layer of fabric. So I've got a tiny little piece here that I've pinking sheared around the edges, and then I'll sit that behind that when I stitch the button on. When you sew the button on, make sure you give a bit of play between the fabric and the button, and definitely do a thread shank going around what you've stitched, because the button is going to be sitting in quite a thick buttonhole and it needs to be able to clear all that thickness. And we're done. Thank you so much for sewing along with me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy using this even more. Bye for now.